You're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show. Your host, Jimmy Petruzzi. Bringing you news from like there and around the world. Very fortunate show to some of the world's best athletes, sports people, coaches, trainers, you name it. They've been on the show. We've spoken to many people in the field of psychology and related fields who give us interesting insights. Today we have a very fascinating guest. I've been really looking forward to interview. We're going to hopefully, I'm going to get some really fantastic insights into the world of performance psychology, which is an area that a lot of our listeners do are definitely very passionate about. But even people who aren't involved in psychology generally get a lot of good feedback around some of the areas we talk about. Some of these sort of skills can be transferable. So our guest today is Jonathan Smith. He's a performance psychologist working with F1 and F2 drivers, and how fascinating is that in terms of I'm definitely looking forward to hearing more about what he does. So JJ, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thanks very much. Really looking forward to chatting today.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. How did you get involved in performance psychology, JJ? What was how did you get into the field to begin with?
So I suppose the first part of it was actually where I found sort of the real interest in sports psychology itself. So I went to Salford University, where an awful lot of people who are interested in sport go to, and I didn't get into sports psychology straight away. I was doing a course in sports science and recreation management, and I was doing a module on sports psychology, and we were looking at an area of burnout. And at the same time as we were looking at that, my sister, who was playing full-time tennis, and she was a professional player in terms of, she had a ranking of about 400 in the world. She was 18, and she came home from a competition, and so basically said, "I've had enough. I'm tired of chasing balls," and the link between the two were just really fascinating for me, and that was where my real interest started from. And then I carried on and just looked to try and understand the area more and more.
Yeah. I mean, like with yourself, obviously, sort of you got experience in different areas. I sort of mentioned Formula One, but you've also worked in sort of different areas as well. And I mean, is there a difference in terms of the work that you do, JJ, with say drivers and say, for example, if you're sort of working with someone in sort of badminton or another sport? I mean, what are some of the differences? I mean, obviously, each individual is their own sort of person, but can you give us maybe an insight into what's it like working with Formula One drivers? I find that really fascinating.
So one of the big differences between, let's say, it's Formula One compared to a sport like badminton or canoeing, which is one of the other sports I work with, is the media attention that drivers have. So you have Formula One drivers who have got followers of 1.5 to 20 million followers on Instagram. They are working in a sport where the teams are spending hundreds of millions of pounds, and the sport is being watched on live by, I'd hazard a guess, 20 plus million odd people watching it. So that in itself creates a pressure where a lot of other sports don't experience it. That's probably one of the main areas that we have to recognise and then try and support them in that.
And in terms of, say, I mean, obviously, I'm sure a lot of the work you do is sort of, confidential, but like what sort of work would you do in terms of, say, how would a Formula One driver, for our listeners, in terms of what sort of psychology would they generally require? I mean, I can imagine obviously got these really quick decisions, and the demands of the sport are surreal.
You're absolutely right. It really varies depending on the individual, and these drivers are exceptional at what they do. I mean, they've started driving age of 4 or 5 karting. They've gone through the ranks through sort of F4 all the way up to F1, and at each of those stages, they've had to prove themselves their ability to get to the next stage.
Yeah.
So these are the top 20 drivers in the world, really.
Wow.
So that's sort of the context that I work with. So they're exceptionally good at what they do, and what we're trying to do with each of them is trying to fine tune some of those elements so that they can really show their exceptional performance in those tight moments where things count. Whether it's at the start where you've got 20 other cars going past, and there's the potential of crashes happening in those moments of time, or it's deciding on picking out the time to overtake or not to overtake. And how to be free in those moments to make the call in the moment, not be dictated by the potential consequences, both of doing well, compared to the consequences of not making the move, for example.
Because I can imagine saying in F1, for example, where the decisions that you've got to make these really quick decisions. I mean, obviously, like in other sports, about decision making as well. But I suppose the consequences of making a wrong decision with sort of great respect to certain sports. I mean, obviously, no one wants to lose, but the consequences of making the wrong decision in F1, can be obviously a lot more severe. You could argue in terms of, say, is that sort of a fair point, JJ? Where, like, if you're driving those sort of speeds, I mean, obviously, you've got the consequences are much more dramatic in terms of making an error type thing.
Well, yes, absolutely. You can talk about consequences in Formula One where there's life and death elements to it. In a sport like canoeing and sprint canoeing, which is a sport which I do some other work in, that really isn't an issue. There's not a life and death for yourself or for others, so that definitely comes into it. But what you find is actually, because of the amount of experience that they've got, that really isn't something that's on their mind. And if they were focused on that, they're probably not going to be successful in the sport. And they've developed their own skills to be able to focus directly on what they're doing in that moment in time. And my job as such is to help them to stay in that place. And every driver will have had a crash at some point in their lives. And how do we make sure that crash that they've had doesn't impact them in their ability to stay in the moment in racing? And when the opportunity arises to overtake, for example, that they take it and they don't hesitate in that moment.
Yeah, and absolutely. I was wondering there, JJ, what I find quite interesting. I mean, this is probably outside the scope of our sort of conversation in terms of, but I sort of wonder, like, in terms of an F1 driver, say, I mean, if they've got the experience of driving, say, very early on in life, but equally in saying, there's a genetic element in terms of, taking that sort of risk in terms of, we're sort of, I think most people, if you're sort of driving around the track type thing, and you're going to be obviously have that much more element of caution. Do you think there might be like a genetic thing in terms of those type of sports that people might have a predisposition to sort of go out there and just like you said, it's kind of just get out there and do it type thing?
I don't know, if I'm perfectly honest, but to answer that one, and I'm not sure whether there's any what research has been done on that area, but what I can say is that the individuals that I've worked with, they've been really varied in their characteristics as well, their personality characteristics. So you do have some people who have a high, would be classed as a high extroversion, but you've also got drivers who are in that F1 paddock who are high introverted. Some who are risk takers in terms of what they do outside of the sport, but others who that love nothing more than sitting at home afterwards, sharing time with 2 or 3 friends, and playing chess. You've got the whole mix of it. So I don't necessarily believe that there is this underpinning characteristic that makes an F1 driver, but what they do have definitely some skill sets that they've developed over the 17 years that they have been driving that enable to be incredibly effective at what they do.
Yeah, no, and I think the thing is as well, what sort of strikes me is the margins between sort of winning, like, and sort of losing in the area. I mean, the margins are so fine, and I mean, how does sort of performance psychology come into that area, Jonathan? The margins being so fine, so small between the tightest of margins being success and being at the top, and maybe not so doing as well.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right on that, Jimmy. In terms of the margins are incredibly small. When you think about the on the qualifying, that you can have it down to 0.01 seconds difference between getting the pole position or coming second. They are really small. I mean, from the front to the back of the grid, then you're looking at two sort of sometimes as much as 2 seconds, which is still tiny margins when you think about it in terms of the lap times.
Yeah.
And so much of that is actually around the car and what the car can do, rather than necessarily what the driver is producing.
Yeah.
So each driver's actual ability is tiny margins between them, and that therefore requires them to absolutely be in the moment, preoccupy in what they're doing at that moment, and not thinking about the future or the past at that time, and how well can we help them to free themselves to allow what they've developed over those past 17 years to just shine through. And the work that we'll quite often do is about how do we help prime them in the build up to a race, so they are in that automatic place, that automatic processing.
Yeah.
So, rather than in a conscious cognitive thinking place in that moment.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I find it really interesting because it's almost like something that can be transferred to other sports in one sense, being in that moment. Is there anything that you can sort of share with us, JJ, in terms of, I know obviously each individual is going to be different in terms of how you work, but are there sort of any insights in terms of like what sort of techniques, like, is it sort of mindfulness? Are there certain things that you might sort of use to help the drivers be in the moment, to focus on the moment, or is it more just sort of practice?
Yeah, there are a whole range of different ways that you can go about doing it, and as you said, Jimmy, it depends on the individual.
Yeah.
There's a bit which we do. I work when working with the drivers, but also within other sports. Almost like a mental priming going into a competition, which I often do, which comes from my time when I worked for Chimp Management. I worked for them for 5 years under Professor Steve Peters, who's absolutely brilliant. And when we developed an approach to help people to actually get into that automatic, which first stage of it is around recognizing that we have a choice to be there, as well as a choice in terms of what we're thinking, and what we're going to focus our attentions on.
Yeah.
Second stage then is around looking at what is in chimp language, our chimp brain, the emotional brain, what is that picking up, which might be unhelpful, and how can we either accept those elements, so that sort of almost you look at it in relation to sort of acceptance and commitment therapy, but also a little bit of CBT element to it in terms of, well, what would be maybe more helpful for us to manage in those moments.
Yeah.
Stage 3 then is around actually going from where we've moved to a neutral mindset to a positive one, and recognizing the truths that are helpful to us to focus on.
Yeah.
Stage 4 then is when we're getting into the computer, and the computer being that fast twitch processing and habitual motor programs that we're looking to get into, which is around using things like visualization, specific stimulus cues that we can identify, which will help us to actually, in those moments, react incredibly quickly whilst also staying in the moment.
That's really interesting. And how long does that sort of, just out of interest, obviously it's difficult to quantify time, but generally how long will that take to go through that process, JJ, like that sort of priming process? Is there like generally a time frame?
So generally, if you added it all up together, you're looking at around about a 15-minute process. But what is brilliant about the process is that you can apply it directly into what the drivers do in the moment, doing that whilst they're just generally getting ready for the race. So stage 1 often is done. They'll do that on their way to the track when they're in the car. Stage 2 then is probably done when they're getting changed and getting into their suits. Stage 3 is when they're doing their physical warm-up. That type of work. And then stage 5 often will do that whilst they're in the pit lane and just getting in the car and just waiting. And there's normally about a 3-4 minute period of time there that they'll just sat there, and this gives them something to actually do whilst they're just sat there with everybody around them. So it doesn't add extra time to it, but it gives them a real focus about what they're going to use their mind for, and being purposeful in what they use their mind for.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I mean, listening to you sort of speak there, it's kind of like, what sort of comes to mind, JJ, say, for example, say in football, you got a penalty shootout, and I can almost sort of see how that could apply where you kind of, the game's sort of done, and the different teams are psychologically going to the penalty shootout, in different sort of, depending on, they might have lost the lead or they might have like just saved the game at the end, but then it's kind of like you go again type thing. I mean, obviously, I know the area that you generally work in is F1, and you've worked in obviously other areas like as well before. But do you think that is possible to maybe sort of transfer a model like that maybe into, say, if it hasn't already been done, into maybe a game like football for a penalty shootout where you kind of break it down and sort of give yourself the best chance to maybe score a goal, or other sports? Do you get people from other sports sort of asking you about sort of how they can prime themselves for performance, or do you just generally just focus on the F1?
No, so I've been really, really fortunate. I've worked with a range of sports over the years. So I worked for a period of time with the FA and with the under-19 women's team, and we explored quite a bit within that around penalty shootouts and how do we both prime the individual ahead of a penalty shootout, as well as then after a penalty has been taken, what does the team then do post-penalty to almost embrace that person back into the team? Because we know that something like a penalty for football, it's an individual thing. High pressure, high responsibility in those moments in time, and the people who put themselves forward for that are incredibly courageous in that moment. And it's so visible about what success and failure looks like in that moment. So we spent a lot of time exploring, okay, when something happens, and particularly those times where there's been a failure, how does the rest of the team bring that person back into the team to make them feel that sense of belonging after a penalty happens?
Oh, okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's fun. And what was just out of interest, like, what was the experience like working at that sort of level with the 19s, Jonathan? How did you sort of find that experience in terms of like, how did they take the sort of performance psychology? What was their perception? Because in football, I suppose, it's a little bit different, I guess. But what was your sort of perception of how they embraced the performance psychology?
So, firstly, it was an amazing experience. I was really lucky. The FA had an incredible team who were of sport and performance psychologists who were working with them and with the individual teams. And when I was there, this was now, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago now. We had, I think it was a group of 9 of us who were working there with different teams from all the way down from the under 15s, I think it was, all the way up to the senior team. And we worked in an approach which was actually a bit of a mix of, yes, we did the individual one-to-one performance psychology support for the players themselves, but actually the big part of our role was around actually the culture that we were trying to create. Within the team, and working alongside and through the various coaches was an important element to that. And they were really engaged in it. They knew the importance of it, and both the athletes and the various head coaches really supported the work that the performance psychologists were doing, and it was a great experience with them. Brilliant.
And in terms of sort of just out of interest, in terms of I know once again it's obviously difficult, each person's different type thing, but what would you say was the sort of, you mentioned the culture, it was sort of really important, creating that sort of culture, but in terms of like preparation and sort of getting ready for matches, was there sort of anything specific that the players, maybe like rehearsal, or what are some of the things that possibly help the players to sort of prepare for the games themselves, to perform at the games to the best of their ability? Is there any sort of specific sort of techniques that you can think of that may have sort of helped some of the players?
So we used to have a real specific, two elements to it. One was the individual element of warming up and preparation for that, but then also the second part was the team element of how do we get the team warmed up, and this required us to really have clarity as to what does success look like for us as a team going into this match. And prior to the day, we'd identify what that looks like. We'd then secondly have our clarity of, well, if for us to achieve that, what does that require of us? in terms of the processes that we want to do.
Yeah.
And how we want to be in those moments, and we developed quite strong sort of principles as to how we approached matches and how we wanted to approach it from a mindset point of view as a team. And then the third bit then was about the actual process that we had on the day, which looked to try and reinforce those elements throughout it. That might be about the huddles that the team have at different points and the message that they provided each other. It might be around how almost the responsibility as the day moved closer and closer to the game, the start of the game. The responsibility moved from the coaches and the support team to the players and to the captain. So the final messages were always delivered by the captain of the team, because actually they're the ones who are going to be on the pitch.
Yeah.
So we have these different elements all looking to link together to help and develop the team so they did play as optimally as possible.
No, so that's really interesting stuff, to be fair. And I suppose for our listeners, it sort of, it does demonstrate how important, the mind psychology is in sport as a sort of variable. I suppose, one thing that I can't sometimes think about, JJ, is how you quantify improving in that. I mean, if you do like physical testing, you can test people physically to see if they're improving, or you've got all sorts of game analysis these days. I mean, do you have like ways of measuring improvement? Are they just generally self-report measurements, or just basically the feedback you get, or a combination of all those things? I mean, is there a way of gauging if they are improving sort of psychologically?
Yeah, so it really varies. Again, it really varies depending on what we're actually looking at. But one of the things that if I use a different sport, if I use canoeing and sprint canoeing, one of the elements that we get when we do sprint canoeing is we do use GPS to recognise the people's sort of speed across time for a 200 metre effort at the time, and you can trace that, and we get almost like a graph that shows people's speed at different points in it. And one bit of work which I remember doing with an athlete a few years ago now was around actually that they used to lose focus during that race, even though it was only a 200 metre effort, but their focus would get drawn across to those who they're competing against, which was unhelpful to them. So what we did was a reset cue for them, and that reset cue was a bit of a sit up, and then they would focus back out. And what we recognised when that happened was that we could see them doing it on that graph, the GPS, that we could actually observe that change that they were doing, and then the impact of that change on their speed. And whilst if you know anything about sprint canoeing, you don't actually necessarily speed up, but you reduce down the rate of slowing down. And so you could actually pinpoint on that graph where that person had done that refocus technique, and then how that's different to what they were doing previously. So yes, at times performance psychology is subjective, and it's using the individual and their perception of what's happening, but there's also various different bits of it where you can be quite objective, and you might be seeing the difference in the change due to a psychological strategy that you put in place.
Absolutely, no, that's really interesting stuff, to be fair. I find it sort of really fascinating how you can sort of see objectively where the things are improving. In terms of your own, I know you've said fantastic. No doubt you'll carry on having a fantastic sort of career at what you do. What would you say some of the highlights have been for yourself, JJ? I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's too many to mention, but on your own journey, do you have any sort of things that sort of come to mind that you feel, from a highlight perspective?
As I said at the beginning, I have been really fortunate in terms of the different groups of people that I've had the privilege or teams that I've had the privilege of working with. So that in itself makes it difficult. But one that does spring to mind is I was really fortunate to be the performance psychologist for the British Paralympic team over in Rio, and I was so looking after the team itself. I was working at the time with British Canoeing, but my role there was actually with the whole team, and that was an incredible experience. The chef de Michelin, Penny Briscoe, who is an amazing lady who has been the chef for a variety of different games over the last sort of 12 plus years. And I worked with her and her team to create an environment and a culture where we were looking to enable people to really thrive.
Yeah.
And they took it on board and they ran with it. And as a team, it has been the most fun I've had, whilst also the most hard working I've had, with some of the greatest challenges I've had. But with all of those things put together, probably my most rewarding experience. And absolutely loved it.
Brilliant. And sort of just finally, JJ's, I mean, we have like a lot of listeners who are sort of aspiring to go into the field of psychology, who are maybe in the field of psychology as well. And what would you say to sort of anyone sort of listening in, maybe starting their journey, considering going into performance psychology, or they may be sort of doing a course? Is there sort of any insights? I know it's hard to give anyone any sort of advice, but maybe any sort of pointers they can sort of think about if they're looking to pursue a career in the performance side of psychology in sport?
Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously the qualifications that you need to go and do to work within sport as a sports psychologist, for example, and working through those takes a lot of dedication and time to do that. But so let's say give that as a given element to it. The extra bit within it is to gain, in my opinion, as many different experiences you can do. Again, I've been really fortunate. I started off as a lecturer and a senior lecturer at a university. I then moved into the applied world, but I started off volunteering in that applied world, and I volunteered for British Canoeing at the time. I remember it was 10 days a year for the talent squad, which I really enjoyed. But just from that experience, that built to a 100-day contract with them, which then within 2 years built to a full-time role with Chimp Management. And throughout my experience, the big thing that's happened is where you do a good job for somebody, they then move on to somewhere else, and then you get asked to do another job for somebody else off the back of that.
Absolutely.
And just the more experience that you can get, the more opportunities you put yourself in front of clubs, coaches, athletes, then you'll reap the reward of that by them seeing the great job that you can do. So volunteer for stuff, put yourself out there, whether it's a university team, whether it's a local club, just do that type of work, and opportunities will present themselves.
Absolutely. I think that's a great takeaway. I think that certainly that's a great opportunity to get out there and experience, and I think that's one of the great things of, I mean in terms of getting experiences, I think it's a great one way to learn. And I mean, do you find that the sort of getting out there and sort of, obviously it's really important to do qualification, put your head down and study hard and work hard, but then when you're out there getting that sort of actual experience, does that give a whole new dimension, do you feel, to the learning?
Yeah, absolutely, because there is definitely one bit which is what theory and research says, and then there's the second bit which is what happens in the real world, and it's finding a way to mix those two elements together, where the magic really happens. And there's, so at British Canoeing we have a group of 7 volunteer development psychs who are working across different squads and in a number of clubs, and within their experience they are really getting to the challenges that come and the joy that comes from working with athletes who are 16, 17, 18 and coaches and finding out about how some of the theories that they've sort of understood and learned at university, how it gets applied and how it gets shown in the real world, and then how the strategies that they've learned at university, how do they actually figure when you're actually working with a human being in a complicated sport where it doesn't fit nicely or nicely into what was sort of how the research was done in a lab setting, for example. There's loads of opportunities to learn, and that ability to think on your feet and to adapt what research suggests with your own experience of what's happening in that environment is a key skill to develop.
Absolutely, that's really interesting. But insight for anyone sort of tuning in. even if they're not involved in sport as well as a lot of professions, is sort of getting out there and sort of getting the experience and sort of building from there. But it's been great speaking to you, Jonathan. I've sort of, taken a few notes myself, to be fair, and it's I'm sure that the listeners really sort of enjoyed it, irrespective of whether they're involved in sport or not. I think it's a great insight to hear, like what you do, and you've been very, very kind to sort of share some of your ideas too, which are fantastic. That was great speaking to you. That was Jonathan Smith, who's really kind enough to join us. Performance psychologist, works in F1 and F2, but as no doubt you've tuned in and heard, he's worked across a broad range of areas. It's fantastic to join us on the Friday Sports Show, 94.4 FM, Salford City Radio host Jimmy Petruzzi.